To our second video on special effects, this one covering, as you can see, computer generated effects. So they'll have a bit more of the practical as well. Here we're seeing what seem to be exterior scenes or interior scenes fading out to where the film was actually shot in a studio. Later we'll be talking about virtual sets. So in any case, we will have here 4 videos that I've kind of cobbled together and truncated so they're not as long. I hope you enjoy. Take care.
The wizard is never late, Frodo Baggins. Nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.
Starting us off at number 10, The Lord of the Rings trilogy. Peter Jackson pushed the envelope in countless ways for his Tolkien-adapted triptych, securing a Best VFX Oscar for each entry in the series. But some of his best effects were more clever sleight of hand than digital wizardry. Faced with the problem of putting 2 average-size actors in the same room to play characters of wildly different scales, Jackson often used forced perspective by exaggerating the distance between an actor and the camera. He would use oversized props for Elijah Wood and undersized props for Ian McKellen and put one far behind the other while positioning the camera in such a way that they looked much closer. And if he wanted to move the camera, wouldn't that break the illusion? Jackson used something called motion control to move the actors counter to the camera's movement in order to maintain the illusion. And when you couldn't see the actor's face, Jackson just used the good old-fashioned wig on a child technique. Classic. Next up at number 9, An American Werewolf in London. When John Landis first set out to transform a man into a wolf in 1981, he approached a computer specialist to ask if it were possible to aid the transition with computer graphics. His answer? Yes, absolutely, but not in that decade. So he called up Rick Baker to do it with makeup instead. They created a transformation unlike anything anybody had seen before. It took 30 technicians, 6 months of preparation, and a whole week of shooting to pull it off, with 10 hours each morning for makeup application and 3 at night for removal. Every shot in the transformation involved a specifically planned appliance that physically underwent just a small section of the transformation, like the rubber hand that stretched pneumatically, or the rubber body that David Naughton piloted with his head sticking out of a hole in the floor, or the incredible shot of hair growing that was actually a reverse shot of hair being pulled through holes in rubber. In the end, the effect was so successful that the Academy created a whole new award category to honor them.
Clear!
Clear.
At number 8, John Carpenter's The Thing. When John Landis called Rick Baker to do the makeup for An American Werewolf in London, he actually pulled him off an incredibly similar project called The Howling, a werewolf story with its own transformation scene to boot. On it, Baker was replaced by his assistant, Rob Bottin. The Howling didn't end up nearly as successful as An American Werewolf in London, but it did give Bottin his first break, which eventually catapulted him towards his unbelievable work on The Thing. Check it out. There's no computers here. Every effect was hand-modeled by Bottin and his team with clay and foam and rubber and paint. In fact, Bottin had so much to do for The Thing that he worked 7 days a week for 57 weeks straight, surviving on a diet of candy bars and cola until the film finally wrapped, at which point he checked into a hospital for exhaustion, all to create some of the most nightmare-inducing creatures ever seen on screen.
Let my people go!
Number 7, The 10 Commandments. We are, of course, talking about the parting of the Red Sea. All the way back in 1956, this absolutely monumental movie moment was brought to life with a little bit of optical compositing and a whole lot of water. In order to achieve the massive parting of the sea, Cecil B. DeMille actually filmed tons and tons of water being dumped into a trough from both sides and then reversed it. When combined with the walls of water filmed sideways, it created a truly miraculous spectacle. And it's actually a remake of DeMille's previous 10 Commandments, shot in the 1920s, which had a similar but smaller effect. Back then, DeMille used the same method to shoot the sequence, just with less color, less sound, and a couple fewer tons of water.
The Force will be with you.
always.
Next up at number 6, Star Wars. We mentioned Star Wars for its CGI, but where would we be if we didn't mention the original trilogy's practical effects? When Lucas set out to make the film and found no effects company capable of what he'd planned, he decided to create one. Thus became Industrial Light and Magic. What makes Star Wars so special is that it was the first film of its kind to feature such a saturation of effects in nearly every frame. From stop motion to blue screen to monster costumes, Star Wars had it all. But if we had to pick one shot, we'd probably pick the very opening of A New Hope, upon which the success of the entire trilogy hinged. It was make or break, as audiences saw Lucas's version of space combat for the first time, and in the end, expectations were shattered. What's even better is that they had intended to model that first Star Destroyer at 50 feet long, but when they ran out of money, they could only manage 4. And yet it is still one of the most epic images ever committed to celluloid, all without the help of a computer. At number 5, The Skeleton Fight from Jason and the Argonauts. If you've never heard of Ray Harryhausen, let this be your introduction. Ray was one of Hollywood's most esteemed stop-motion animators. Originally inspired by King Kong, whose subway destruction sequence narrowly missed this list, Ray took up claymation at a very young age. And by the time he reached Jason and the Argonauts, he was pioneering techniques that seamlessly blended live action with stop-motion footage. It is astonishing how very real, alive, and life-size his monsters look, even though they are clay miniatures shot completely separately from the actors shown here. In fact, it took Ray nearly 4.5 months to create this sequence, during which he managed just 13 frames, or just over half a second of footage each day. And the kicker is that he worked completely alone. No assistants, no 30-person team at his side, just Ray Harryhausen in his studio, bringing monsters to life. Next up at number 4, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Kubrick's unforgettable space opera boasts hundreds of effect shots, all before the era of computer-generated effects, even before anyone had seen a full image of Earth. And while the celestial sequences are breathtaking, there's nothing quite as cool as the 10-minute hallucinogenic Stargate. And while nowadays any soccer mom with iMovie could probably create a home video Stargate montage of their own, remember that this is the 1960s, and computers still used magnetic tape storage. The task fell to special effects supervisor Doug Trumbull, who spent a full 2.5 years on 2001, where he famously repurposed the panoramic photograph technique called slit scan to shoot the sequence in camera. Basically, he exposed the entire sequence frame by frame, and each frame millimeter by millimeter from the center outwards. He's also the same guy who, almost 50 years later, created the stunning supernova sequences from Tree of Life, again without any help from a computer, which, at that point, just seemed like showing off. Closing in at number 3, the rotating set. Now we could keep talking about 2001 here, because the $750,000 centrifuge set was probably second only to the Stargate sequence. But we're actually going to look elsewhere. If you're thinking Inception, that's a good guess, because the fight choreography in the hallway sequence is absolutely astounding. However, we're actually going to go in the opposite direction, back to 1951 with Royal Wedding, which premiered anti-gravity in a grand fashion, with Fred Astaire dancing up the walls, onto the ceiling, and all the way around the room. The entire set was built into a geared barrel, with all the furniture anchored in place, and the camera is fixed to the room so that they rotate together, making it appear as though it is Astaire who moves around the room, not the other way around. Royal Wedding's director Stanley Donen actually reused the effect 35 years later for Lionel Richie's Dancing on the Ceiling, which clocked in as the most expensive music video ever made at that time.
What are you? I'm Gotham's reckoning.
Now, if you're bummed we skipped over Chris Nolan for his take on the rotating room, may we direct your attention to number 2, Dark Knight Rises. Nolan's known for pulling off ridiculous on-screen stunts that any sane director would do digitally. In addition to rotating a hallway, he exploded a city street, flipped a semi-truck, and we're seriously hoping he finds a way to open an actual wormhole for Interstellar. But his most impressive stunt yet was the plane heist from the opening of The Dark Knight Rises. Those stuntmen are actually jumping out of a plane onto another plane. And that second plane is actually being suspended from the plane above it. And that plane's fuselage is actually being dropped from thousands of feet in the air. And just because we haven't gotten our fill of rotating sets, you should know that the interiors of the scene were shot on a soundstage with a rotating fuselage just like the one from Inception.
Come with me if you want to live.
And finally, at number 1, Terminator 2. Yes, Terminator 2's got some wicked special effects, from prosthetics and articulated puppets to blowing up LA and this awesome sliced-in-half costume. But the #1 slot goes to something which was just incredibly clever and, surprisingly, left on the cutting room floor. In this scene where John and Sarah Connor reset the T-800's learning chip, you can clearly see Sarah and the Terminator both from behind and through the mirror. But since Arnie obviously doesn't have a real hole in his head and CGI wasn't an option, how did they pull this off? I know you're probably thinking they just replaced the mirror with a green screen, but they didn't even do that, because there wasn't a mirror at all. That's actually a hole into another identical but mirrored room. Sitting in front of it is a hollow skull prosthetic, and behind it is the real Schwarzenegger. But how did they get two Sarah Connors? Even simpler. They used Linda Hamilton's twin sister. Because when it comes down to it, the simplest special effects solution is usually the best. Because ultimately, it's not about man-hours or model size or number of polygons used. It's about convincing the audience that something totally impossible is actually real. And that's exactly what they did here. Which is why we think that this is the best
From 2010 to 2019, technology changed in major ways, which had a huge impact on the movies we watched. From realistic environments to convincing fake animals, to aging and de-aging actors and even doubling them, it almost felt like there was nothing CGI couldn't do. Let's take a look at some CGI from the past decade that took movies to the next level. Thanks to motion capture technology, actors could show their full range of emotions while being transformed into basically any kind of creature. Mocap was honed in the 2000s in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, King Kong, and Avatar. It became commonplace in the 2010s, hitting its stride over the course of the Planet of the Apes reboot trilogy. Much of the work on all these movies was done by the famed visual effects studio Weta Digital. By the time of Rise of the Planet of the Apes, cameras were able to capture the most subtle of movements and details, which made the apes more believable. And Rise was also the first movie to ever shoot motion capture in a live-action location, as opposed to just a bare soundstage. This development would later help them to shoot in even more challenging locations, like the Vancouver rainforest in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, and on beaches and in deep snow in War for the Planet of the Apes. It wasn't Andy Serkis's only big motion capture character of the two. Serkis played the menacing Supreme Leader Snoke. He showed up as a hologram in The Force Awakens and then in person in The Last Jedi. According to Industrial Light and Magic creative director Ben Morris, they didn't even have the tools to make Snoke look this realistic in The Force Awakens. By the time The Last Jedi rolled around, they were able to add so many details to the skin, like age spots and veins. The visual effects team shot Serkis with high-resolution cameras positioned at every conceivable angle to create a digital clone of him. As Serkis performed, they could automatically capture every subtle facial move, from how he smiles to how he furrows his brow. They even studied the elderly to see how light would realistically hit Snoke's skin. The technology ILM developed in collaboration with Disney Research has been used to capture many actors. One of the most prominent? Josh Brolin as Thanos. Look closely and you can see every crease, every pore of the Avengers villain's skin. In the live-action Jungle Book remake, actor Neil Sethi played Mowgli and was the only human character in the film. He acted on a completely empty soundstage, besides these puppets and creature performers that would then be digitally replaced with the actual CGI characters. The biggest breakthrough on this movie? Muscle movement. MPC Film developed new software for animating an animal's muscle structure. All of MPC Film's work directly contributed to its work on 2019's The Lion King. The VFX artists perfected their already developed muscle and movement simulations. They also added more joints and bones under the skin as a way to make the characters' movements more natural. Otherwise, CGI creations run the risk of being either too bouncy or too stiff when they move. And the environments created for the Jungle Book were made in virtual production, which required virtual reality techniques, allowing filmmakers to step foot in these environments and better place their characters in them. This was also used to a more advanced degree in 2019's The Lion King. But with great CGI comes great responsibility. This Star Wars prequel brought back the Empire's sinister Grand Moff Tarkin. However, actor Peter Cushing died in 1994, so Industrial Light and Magic used CGI to bring him back to life. Another actor, Guy Henry, stood in as Cushing and did his best Tarkin impression. A mounted camera rig captured his facial movements. Then, ILM used his performance as a guide to digitally recreate Cushing. The whole process took about 18 months to complete. While Cushing's estate gave its blessing, the decision was still controversial. Should you bring back an actor from the dead? This issue isn't going anywhere. The upcoming Vietnam War-era drama Finding Jack caused an uproar with news that it cast a CGI version of long-deceased Hollywood legend James. In Blade Runner 2049, the VFX wizards at MPC Film created a digital double of actress Sean Young so she could reprise her role as Rachel from the original Blade Runner. It may be the most convincing digital double yet. To create the digital Rachel, they 3D scanned Young and aged her back to how she looked in the original Blade Runner. Like with muscles and joints in the Jungle Book, the most crucial CGI here is what you don't see: the skull. To create a CGI skull, they combined the 3D scan with a life cast done of Young shortly after the original Blade Runner. Focusing on building this character's skull allowed the artist to build the character's de-aged features around it. In addition, they focused on subtleties in Young's face and even how makeup was done in the 1980s. Actress Lauren Pita doubled on set before being replaced by the de-aged Young. VFX supervisor John Nelson also said the team closely studied the character's emotions in the original Blade Runner and incorporated them into the double, helping to make real and fake almost indistinguishable. Digital doubles got so realistic that they would eventually allow Will Smith to act alongside a younger version of himself while performing both parts in 2019's Gemini Man.
While filming this scene from Disney's The Mandalorian, the actors could see their surroundings, but the surroundings weren't actually there. All of this is just LED screens, displaying backgrounds pre-made in a video game engine. Compare that with this fight scene from Avengers Endgame, where actors jumped around in a sea of green, imagining how VFX artists would make this planet look once filming had ended. The Mandalorian is one of the first major productions to choose LED walls over green screens, and the benefits for the actors are just the tip of the iceberg. LED walls make the lighting better, filming smoother, and in certain cases cost a lot less than using green screens. But to understand why the team behind The Mandalorian chose these LED screens, we have to understand just how they work. Mandalorian showrunner Jon Favreau revolutionized virtual production while directing The Lion King and The Jungle Book. However, the process for these two remakes still relied heavily on blue screen and post-production work. For The Mandalorian, LED wall technology seemed like the next logical step, given the show's production budget and time frame. Now, you may be thinking, this isn't so new. I've seen something like this before. And you're right, kind of. The predecessor to what we see on The Mandalorian is a driving scene like this one from Dr. No. You've got the actor in the car, and behind them, a screen with footage of the road they've travelled. But the technology was limited. Say you want to move the camera angle during the scene. That projected footage can't move with the camera. But by using Unreal Engine, tech borrowed from the video game field, that problem is solved. Artists can create a photorealistic 3D background that moves strictly with the camera's field of view, known as the frustum. So if the camera swings around and changes angles, the background shifts in precisely the same way. This allows motion-tracked cameras to execute traditional cinematography techniques within the virtual set, achieving cinematic movements like the parallax effect, where an object in the foreground moves at a different speed than the background, amplifies the illusion of filming at an actual location. He says lighting is one of the key benefits of working with virtual sets. The light coming from the LEDs provide realistic colours and reflections on the actors and props, something you simply can't achieve with green screen. They are also able to completely avoid the problem of spill. To better understand that, we talked to Kim Libreri at Epic Games, creators of Unreal Engine, which was used to build the virtual sets for The Mandalorian.
The problem with a green screen is that you have to have a green screen behind you. And what that does is that instead of projecting beautiful lighting from what the environment would be behind you, it basically puts a lot of green light on you. And we call that spill. If you wrap an actor with a big 360 LED wall, you can light in a way that you would never be able to do on a green screen. So you can really make it feel like the characters are embedded in their environments.
This green screen spill would have been an even bigger problem than usual for The Mandalorian, whose main character gets a shiny new suit of armor early on in the season. So realistic lighting from the LEDs makes the show look better, but virtual sets help with practical concerns too. Take this scene in the office of the client, played by Werner Herzog. In a scene like this, surely they just built a simple set, right? Wrong. All of this is that same LED screen. According to Richard, only the desk, the floor, and 1 or 2 columns were really there.
Everything else was displayed on the screen. But this allowed us to limit the amount of stage space that we used in shooting season 1 of The Mandalorian, which has understandably a big impact on time and budget.
To be fair, the initial investment in a virtual set like this is huge. However, the creators claim that money saved from traveling to locations, building new sets, and costly post-production can make the investment worth it.